The heavens burned with gold as Soren stood before the council, his black wings spread wide. His tall figure towered over the other angels, but his head was bowed. For all his strength and grace, he could feel judgment tightening around him like a vice. "You defy us, Soren," boomed the voice of the archangel. It was steady, calm, too calm. "You have abandoned your purpose. You let mortals perish when you were sent to protect them. And now you dare to question the will of the Creator?" Soren's jaw clenched. His piercing silver-gray eyes, glowing faintly with divine power, snapped upward. He was done bowing. "They were weak," Soren growled, his deep voice trembling with fury. "Why should we waste our light on creatures who crumble with time? They are fleeting, flawed, wretched things. And yet, they're the ones you love most?" A murmur rippled through the assembly of angels. Soren's words weren't just defiance. They were blasphemy. "They are imperfect," the archangel replied, his tone sharp now. "But it is in their imperfection that they reflect the Creator's design. You, Soren, have forgotten your place." Soren's wings twitched, the faint glow at their edges flickering. He felt the weight of every gaze on him, every whisper. His fists clenched. "I don't belong among these pathetic mortals. Let me stay in the heavens where I was meant to be. Let me fight for glory, not waste my strength on their pitiful lives." The archangel stepped forward, towering yet calm. "You have made your choice, Soren. And now, you will fall." Before Soren could react, light exploded around him. A searing golden blaze that burned through his very being. His wings, so powerful and proud, began to wither and twist, their feathers darkening into shadows. His strength, his glory, his divinity, all of it ripped away. Soren screamed, his voice a raw and terrible sound. As he plummeted from the heavens, the sky tore open, casting him down like a meteor streaking through the dark. "18-year-old Maya sat in the farthest corner of the cafeteria, head down, her tray untouched. Around her, laughter and chatter filled the room, but none of it reached her. "Freak," someone muttered as they passed her table. Another girl stifled a laugh. Maya's ears burned, but she kept her eyes on her plate, pretending not to hear. She wasn't special. Not beautiful, not bold. Her clothes were plain, her voice quiet. She was the girl everyone forgot, except when they wanted someone to mock. The bell rang, and Maya gathered her things quickly, slipping out of the cafeteria before the crowd could swallow her. She walked through the halls with her shoulders hunched, her dreadlocks brushing against her cheeks. She hated the way they whispered about her, hated the way their eyes followed her like she was some kind of joke. But the one thing she hated most was how much she wished for something, anything, to make her life matter. The night was cold and silent. Maya hugged her sweater closer as she walked home, the dark forest lining the edge of the road. She liked walking this way, where the stars peeked through the branches and no one could bother her. But tonight, the air felt different, heavy. She stopped, her breath catching. Ahead through the trees, a faint light glowed. It was strange, flickering and golden, unlike anything she'd ever seen. "What is that?" she whispered, stepping off the path. The closer she got, the brighter the light became, until suddenly it disappeared. A faint rustle of leaves broke the silence, followed by a low groan. Maya froze. Lying at the base of a tree, half hidden in the shadows, was a man. No, a being. He was enormous, with a broad chest and long limbs, his skin dark as midnight. His black wings, impossibly large, lay crumpled around him, their feathers tattered and burned. His head hung low, silver gray eyes staring at the ground. Maya's heart pounded. "Oh my God," she whispered. At her voice, the figure stirred. Slowly, painfully, he raised his head. His eyes locked onto hers, and Maya felt something inside her tighten. Fear, awe, maybe even desire. "You," the man said, his voice a rasp. "Come here." Maya's legs refused to move. "Who? What are you?" The man's lips curved into a faint, bitter smile. "An angel," he said, though the word dripped with something darker. "Or I was." Despite every instinct telling her to run, Maya stepped closer. She couldn't look away from him, his striking face, his ruined wings, the sheer presence he radiated. "You're hurt," she said softly. Soren let out a short, humorless laugh. "Brilliant observation." Maya hesitated. "I can help. My house is just down the road." He tilted his head, studying her. She looked so small, so fragile. Her big brown eyes wide with fear and something else. Devotion, perhaps. It was pathetic how willing she was to offer herself to a stranger. Yet he couldn't deny how much her humanity intrigued him. "Take me there," he said, his voice firm. "Now." Maya flinched but nodded, moving to his side. She helped him stand, her hands trembling as she felt the heat of his skin. He leaned on her, his weight making her stagger. As they walked toward her home, Soren's lips twisted into a smirk. "Why do you trust so easily, little human?" "I don't know," Maya admitted, her voice barely a whisper. I feel like I'm supposed to help you." Soren's smirk faded. He looked down at her, his silver gray eyes narrowing. "You're a fool," he said softly. "But I suppose fools are useful." The creak of the old mattress broke the silence in Maya's room. Soren sat on the edge of her bed, his ruined wings folded tightly against his back. In the dim glow of her desk lamp, his dark skin gleamed, and his silver gray eyes watched her with an intensity that made her feel exposed. Maya stood awkwardly in the corner, clutching a first aid kit. "Your wings," she murmured. "Should do you need me to?" Soren tilted his head, studying her as though she were some strange, fragile thing. "You can't fix them," he said bluntly. "You're mortal. What could you possibly do for me?" Her cheeks flushed. I thought I could help." "Help?" he repeated, the word curling bitterly on his tongue. His gaze flicked over her thin frame, her trembling hands, her wide, earnest eyes. She looked like she might shatter under the weight of his presence. And yet, she stayed. Soren leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "There is one thing," he said, his voice low and measured, "but it's not gentle." Maya swallowed hard, her heart pounding. "What do you mean?" He stood abruptly, towering over her. "I am not like you," he said, his tone sharp but not unkind. "To survive, I need more than food or water. I need light, your essence, the part of you that makes you human." Maya's breath hitched. "You mean my soul?" Soren let out a short laugh, his wings rustling behind him. "Not all of it," he said, "just enough to keep me alive." Maya hesitated, her fingers tightening around the first aid kit. "Will it hurt?" He stepped closer, his silver gray eyes piercing hers. "Yes," he said simply, "but only if you're afraid." Her throat tightened, but she nodded. "Okay. If it will help you, then..." "Okay." Soren blinked, caught off guard by her willingness. He expected resistance, hesitation. Instead, she looked at him like she was ready to give him anything he asked for. "You're a fool," he muttered, but his voice lacked venom. He reached for her gently, his hands warm and rough as they cupped her face. "Close your eyes," he said. Maya obeyed. Soren leaned in, his lips brushing against the soft curve of her neck. For a moment, he hesitated, his breath warm against her skin. He hated how much he wanted this, how much he wanted her. Then, he bit down. A sharp gasp escaped Maya's lips, followed by a soft whimper. She felt a strange pull, like a thread unraveling deep inside her. It wasn't painful, exactly, but it was overwhelming. Her knees buckled, and Soren caught her, his arm wrapping around her waist as he fed. The room seemed to darken around them, the air heavy and electric. Maya felt her heartbeat slow, her breath shallow, as though the very essence of her life was slipping away. But then, just as suddenly as it began, Soren pulled back. He stepped away, his chest rising and falling as though he'd just surfaced from deep water. Maya collapsed onto the bed, her body trembling. "That was strange," she murmured, her voice faint. Soren wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, avoiding her gaze. "You'll live," he said gruffly. Her head lolled to the side, her brown eyes wide and glassy. "Do you feel better now?" He looked at her, and for the first time he felt a twinge of guilt. She was pale, fragile, and yet she was smiling at him, soft and sweet, as though he hadn't just taken a piece of her soul. "Yes," he said quietly. "I do." The next morning, Maya woke to find Soren standing by the window, his massive wings partially unfurled. The soft morning light filtered through them, highlighting their jagged edges. "You're still here," she said groggily, her voice laced with relief. Soren turned, his silver gray eyes unreadable. "You didn't think I'd stay, did you?" She sat up slowly, her body still weak from the night before. "I don't know. I thought maybe—" Her voice trailed off. Soren tilted his head, his gaze lingering on her face. "You're strange," he said finally. Maya blinked. "What do you mean?" "You let me take from you," he said, stepping closer. "Without hesitation, without question. Why?" She hesitated, her fingers twisting in the sheets. "Because I want to help you," she said softly. Soren laughed, a low, bitter sound. "Help me? You barely know me." "I know enough," she said firmly. "I know you're in pain, and I know I can't just leave you like this." His smirk faded, replaced by something darker. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. "You think I'm worth saving?" "Yes," she whispered. Soren's jaw tightened. For a moment he said nothing, his piercing gaze searching hers. Then he straightened, his wings folding tightly against his back. "You're a fool," he muttered again, but this time, his voice was softer. Maya only looked back at him, this beautiful angel staring down at her, and realized how cold the morning was. A faint shiver ran through her as the chill in the air seeped into her skin. "Are you cold?" she asked, her voice gentle, breaking the silence, realizing he was still shirtless. Soren's brows furrowed slightly, his expression unreadable. "I don't," he began. But before he could finish, she had already stepped from the bed. "I'll get something for you," she said over her shoulder, her bare feet padding softly across the floor. He watched her disappear through the door, the soft rustle of her movement echoing faintly in the quiet room. His sharp eyes lingered on the space she had left behind, confusion and something unfamiliar flickering in their depths. When she returned, she carried a large gray shirt draped over her arm. It was plain, oversized, and slightly worn, but she held it out to him with a small, hopeful smile. "Here," she said. "This should fit you. It'll keep you warm." Soren tilted his head, his wings twitching faintly as he eyed the garment. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low and skeptical. "It's a shirt," she replied, her smile widening just a little as she stepped closer. It'll keep you warm. She began helping him slide his arm through the sleeves before he could argue. The shirt was just large enough to fit, stretching snugly over his broad shoulders and draping loosely around his tall frame. Surprisingly, it accommodated his massive wings as well, the fabric bunching slightly where they emerged from his back. "This belonged to your father," Soren said quietly, his voice edged with something softer, almost hesitant. "It did," Maya admitted, smoothing the fabric across his chest. "He never wore it, though. Bought it way too big for himself." She stepped back, tilting her head as she took in the sight of him. "But it fits you perfectly." Soren hesitated, his hands brushing the edge of the shirt as if it were something foreign, something fragile. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice laced with a rare uncertainty. He wasn't asking about the shirt, not entirely. He was asking if she was sure about giving him this small piece of her life, her past, a piece of her family. Maya's smile faltered, just for a moment, before she nodded. "Yes, Dad won't mind. He's gone. And Mom..." Her voice trailed off, her gaze dropping to the floor for a brief second before she looked back up at him. "She's never here either." Soren's chest tightened. For a moment, he said nothing, his gray eyes searching hers. Then, slowly, he reached out, his hand brushing lightly against her cheek. "I know," he murmured, his tone unreadable, his gaze fixed on hers with an intensity that made her feel small. The faintest flicker crossed his face. Not a smile, but something sharper, thoughtful, perhaps displeased. His words came slow, deliberate. "More than you realize, about your sad and pitiful life." Maya froze, her breath catching in her throat. His words felt like a blade sliding between her ribs, soft, deliberate, undeniable. She stared into his silver-gray eyes, the eyes of an angel, and saw it, the truth gleaming there like a mirror reflecting all the things she wanted to hide. He knew. "You know about me?" she whispered, her voice trembling, barely audible. The weight of his gaze bore down on her, and she shrank slightly, pulling into herself even as his hand lingered on her. She felt stripped bare, exposed in a way that left her raw. "How much?" she asked. "A lot," Soren replied, his voice so low it barely broke the silence. His hand, strong but unmoving, stayed where it was, as though holding her there for the moment to sink in. "You have no one. Never have. And you never will," he said, his tone neither cruel nor kind. Maya flinched at his words, her throat tightening. They weren't a revelation. She'd lived that truth every day. But hearing them from him, from this impossibly beautiful creature who had seen her from the heavens, was unbearable. A flush crept up her neck, a mix of anger, shame, and confusion. Soren tilted his head slightly, studying her. "From up there." He gestured vaguely, his expression still inscrutable. "We see everything." Maya's knees threatened to buckle. Her face burned as though every failure, every humiliation, every moment of loneliness she'd ever endured had been written in a book he had read cover to cover. And now he stood before her, holding that knowledge in his hands like a weapon he could wield at will. "You don't know me," she managed, her voice quivering, her words as much for herself as for him. His gaze lingered, heavy and unyielding. "Don't I?" The question hung in the air, a challenge, a truth she couldn't deny. She didn't pull away. That afternoon, Maya went to school, her body still weak, but her spirit lighter than it had been in weeks. Soren followed her, invisible but ever-present, his sharp gaze watching her every move. In the hallway, Maya's steps faltered as she spotted Caleb, the brown-skinned boy with the easy smile. He was leaning against a locker, talking to a friend, his laugh ringing out like music. Soren's lips curled into a sneer. Maya's heart raced as she watched Caleb, her cheeks warming. She didn't notice the subtle shift in the air, the way the shadows around her seemed to thicken. "You're staring," Soren's voice whispered in her ear, low and mocking. Maya jumped, her eyes darting around the empty hall. "You scared me," she hissed under her breath. Soren appeared beside her, his form cloaked in shadows, so no one else could see him. "Who is he?" he asked, his voice tight. "Caleb," she said softly, her gaze flicking back to the boy. He's nice." "Nice?" Soren repeated, his tone dripping with disdain. "What a fascinating trait." Maya frowned. "What's your problem?" Soren's silver-gray eyes darkened. "You're mine," he said simply. Her breath caught, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you mean?" He leaned closer, his voice a low growl. "It means I won't share you, little human." The hallway felt colder as Soren's words hung in the air. Maya stared at him, her chest tight, her breath shallow. "Mine." The word sent a shiver through her, not from fear, but something deeper, something she didn't understand. You don't own me," she said softly, her voice trembling. Soren's smirk deepened, though his piercing gray eyes stayed locked on Caleb. "Don't I?" he murmured, almost to himself. His voice was low, predatory, like a lion watching prey. Maya swallowed hard. "Why does it matter who I talk to? He's just a boy." Soren's gaze snapped back to her. His wings unfurled slightly, just enough to cast a faint shadow over the lockers behind her. "He's not just a boy," he said, his voice sharp. "He's human. You're human. You think he understands you?" "Better than you do," Maya shot back before she could stop herself. The shift in Soren's expression was immediate. His jaw tightened, his eyes darkening like a storm, and for a moment, Maya thought he might lash out, but then his lips curved into a humorless smile. "You're wrong," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "I understand you better than anyone. I know how they treat you. I know how lonely you are. And I know..." He stepped closer, his towering figure blocking out the light, "that you'd do anything to feel wanted." Maya's face flushed with heat. "That's not true," she whispered, but even as she said it, she felt the weight of his words pressing against her chest. "It is," Soren said simply. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "And that's why you'll always choose me." The bell rang, breaking the moment like glass shattering. Soren faded into the shadows as students flooded the hallway. Maya felt her legs wobble, her back pressing against the cold metal lockers. "Maya." She looked up sharply, her heart skipping a beat. Caleb stood in front of her, his warm brown eyes filled with concern. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. Maya forced a small smile, though her chest still ached from her exchange with Soren. "I'm fine," she lied. "You looked kind of shaken," Caleb said, tilting his head. "Do you want to sit together in the library? Maybe get away from all this?" He gestured vaguely at the bustling hallway. Maya hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if she might see Soren lurking nearby. "I don't know," she said quietly. "It's okay if you don't want to," Caleb said quickly, stepping back. "I just thought, I'd like that," she interrupted, surprising herself. Her cheeks warmed as she added, "Thank you." Caleb smiled, and for a moment the world felt lighter. The library was quiet, filled only with the faint rustle of pages and the hum of fluorescent lights. Caleb and Maya sat at a small table, their books forgotten as they talked. "I've seen you in art class," Caleb said, leaning forward. "You're always sketching something amazing. Why don't you ever show anyone?" Maya shrugged, her fingers twisting in her lap. "It's just something I do. It's not that great." I doubt that, Caleb said, his smile soft. I bet it's incredible. Maya felt a flicker of warmth in her chest. No one ever noticed her, let alone complimented her. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the air around her shifted. A chill ran down her spine, and her eyes darted toward the darkened corner of the library. She couldn't see him, but she could feel him, Soren's presence, heavy and oppressive, pressing against her senses. Everything okay? Caleb asked, his brow furrowed. Yeah, Maya said quickly, forcing a smile. I'm fine. That night, Maya returned home to find Soren waiting for her. He sat on the edge of her bed, his wings stretched out behind him, their black edges catching the faint glow of her desk lamp. Did you have fun? He asked, his voice calm, almost casual. Maya hesitated in the doorway. What are you talking about? Don't play coy, Soren said, standing. His towering figure made the small room feel even smaller. The boy, Caleb, you were with him. So what? Maya snapped, surprising herself. I'm allowed to have friends. Soren's eyes darkened, his wings twitching. Friends? He repeated, his tone laced with mockery. Is that what he is? Just a friend? Maya crossed her arms, her frustration bubbling to the surface. Yes, and even if he wasn't, it's none of your business. Soren stepped closer, his presence suffocating. None of my business, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Everything about you is my business, Maya. You belong to me. Her breath caught, her heart pounding in her chest. I'm not yours, she said, her voice shaking. Soren tilted his head, his lips curling into a cruel smile. Aren't you? For a moment they stood in silence, the tension between them thick enough to choke. Then, to Maya's surprise, Soren's expression softened. I don't want to hurt you, he said quietly, his voice almost tender. But I can't let you forget what I am. Maya's throat tightened. And what are you? His silver-gray eyes burned as he replied. Your salvation, or your destruction. The choice is yours. Are you afraid of me? He asked, his voice low, rough around the edges. The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the window. Maya stood near the bed, her fingers brushing nervously against the edge of her tattered t-shirt. Soren was watching her. He always watched her, with those piercing silver-gray eyes that seemed to see everything, even the parts of her she tried to keep hidden. No, Maya whispered, her voice trembling, but not with fear. Soren's wings twitched slightly, their black sheen catching the moonlight. He stepped closer, his tall, commanding figure casting a shadow over her. His gaze softened for the briefest moment, and in that instant, Maya felt the tension between them dissolve into something warmer, something impossible to resist. She reached out, her fingers grazing his chest, tracing the faint scars that marked his fall. I'm not afraid, she said again, this time steadier. I want this. I want you. Soren's jaw tightened, his expression torn. He had wanted her from the moment he saw her, wanted her in ways that made him question everything he'd ever believed. And now, as she stood before him, vulnerable and unflinching, he felt that want clawing at him, consuming him. You don't understand, he said, his voice strained. If I take too much, you could... I trust you, Maya interrupted, her brown eyes searching his. Something inside him broke. Without another word, he pulled her closer, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was as much hunger as it was desperation. Later, as they lay tangled together on the bed, the room quiet except for the sound of their breathing, Soren pressed his forehead to hers, his fingers brushing against her cheek. I can't stop it now, he murmured. I need to feed. Maya nodded, her fingers curling into his as she whispered, "Then take what you need." Her trust should have been a comfort, but it felt like a dagger in his chest. He didn't deserve her trust, her kindness, or the warmth she offered so freely. But he couldn't stop himself. Not now. Not when her very presence was a flame that burned him alive. He kissed her again, his lips moving to the curve of her neck. For a moment, he hesitated, his breath hot against her skin. Then, with a growl low in his throat, he bit down. Maya gasped, her body arching as a rush of warmth flooded through her. It wasn't pain, it was something deeper, a pull that left her trembling and breathless. Soren's grip on her tightened as he fed, his fingers digging into her hips as though anchoring himself. The air in the room grew heavier, charged with energy that crackled like a storm. Soren's wings unfurled behind him, their black glow intensifying as he drank more deeply, more hungrily than ever before. Maya's vision blurred, her body growing weaker with each passing second. She felt her strength slipping away, her heartbeat slowing, but she didn't resist. She didn't want to. "Soren," she whispered, her voice barely audible. His eyes snapped open, glowing faintly as he pulled back sharply. Maya slumped against the bed, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. For a long moment, Soren didn't move. His hands trembled as he stared at her, horrified by what he'd done. Her skin was pale, her limbs limp, and yet, despite it all, she smiled up at him. "You're okay," she said softly, her voice weak but steady. "I'm okay." "No," Soren growled, his voice laced with guilt. He cupped her face, his thumb brushing against her cheek. "I've taken too much. You should hate me for this." "I could never hate you," Maya said, her smile widening slightly, though it took effort. "You're everything to me." Soren closed his eyes, his jaw tightening as he fought the wave of emotions threatening to consume him. He was an angel. He wasn't supposed to feel this way, wasn't supposed to crave, to hunger, to love. And yet here she was, fragile and human, smiling at him as though he hadn't just nearly destroyed her. "I'll find a way to stop this," he whispered, his voice raw. "To stop hurting you." Maya shook her head faintly. "You won't hurt me. Not really." Soren leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead, his lips lingering against her skin. "You're wrong," he said softly, his voice trembling. "And I'm not sure I can forgive myself for it." As she drifted into sleep, her hand rested lightly on his, her smile still warm despite her exhaustion. And for the first time in centuries, Soren felt the sting of tears in his eyes. He was breaking every law of heaven. But as he watched her breathe, as he felt the fragile rhythm of her heart beneath his hand, he realized something that terrified him. He would break every law again, just to keep her with him. The sky above Maya's house turned dark and restless that night. Thunder rumbled in the distance, though no storm had been forecasted. Soren stood at the edge of the forest, his black wings unfurled, his sharp gaze scanning the shadows. He could feel them, celestial hunters. Their presence prickled against his senses, like static in the air. They were close. Inside the house, Maya was pacing nervously. She hadn't been able to shake the weight of Soren's words earlier. Your salvation, or your destruction. She glanced at the door, where he had disappeared hours ago, and a knot tightened in her chest. Suddenly, the air seemed to hum with energy. Maya flinched as a bright light exploded outside, filling the room with blinding gold. Soren's voice cut through the noise, sharp and commanding. "Stay inside!" Maya rushed to the window just in time to see him step forward into the clearing, his black wings glowing faintly in the night. Opposing him were two figures clad in armor that gleamed like sunlight, their faces impassive and cold. You've broken the laws of heaven, Soren, one of the hunters intoned, their voice echoing unnaturally. Surrender now, and you may yet find mercy. Soren's laugh was harsh and hollow. Mercy? He spat. You've come to kill me, haven't you? The second hunter stepped forward, their grip tightening on a blade that shimmered with holy light. You've defied the Creator. You've bonded with a mortal. Your punishment is inevitable. Soren smirked, his wings flexing. Then let's not waste time. The first strike was blinding. The hunter's blade arced toward Soren with deadly precision, but he leapt into the air, his massive wings propelling him upward. The force of the strike sent shockwaves through the clearing, flattening the grass and shaking the trees. Maya watched, her heart pounding, as Soren dove toward the hunter, his fists glowing faintly with dark energy. When he landed, the ground cracked beneath him, and the air was filled with the sound of clashing steel and furious roars. Soren! She screamed, unable to stop herself. Her voice distracted him for only a second, but it was enough. One of the hunters lunged forward, their blade slicing across his shoulder. Soren grunted in pain, stumbling backward. He glared at Maya, his expression furious. I told you to stay inside. Maya hesitated, her hands gripping the windowsill. I couldn't. Get down! Soren shouted as the second hunter hurled a bolt of golden light toward the house. Maya ducked just in time as the energy shattered the window, spraying glass across the room. The battle raged on, but Soren was faltering. The hunters were relentless, their strikes precise and merciless. Blood dripped from his wounds, dark and shimmering, pooling on the ground like liquid shadow. Maya couldn't watch any longer. She burst out of the house, her bare feet skidding on the damp grass. Stop! She cried, running toward Soren. The hunters turned to her, their expressions unreadable. One raised their blade, the tip gleaming as it pointed at her. This mortal is nothing to you, Soren, they said coldly. Why do you let her weaken you? Soren stepped in front of Maya, his wings spreading to shield her from their gaze. She's mine, he growled, his voice raw and dangerous. Then she'll die with you, the hunter replied, lunging forward. Time seemed to slow. Maya felt Soren's arms wrap around her, pulling her against his chest. His wings folded tightly around them both, creating a barrier of black feathers as the hunter's blade struck. The impact sent Soren crashing to the ground, his wings shuddering with the force of the blow. Maya scrambled to her knees, her hands shaking as she touched his face. Soren, get up. His eyes fluttered open, his breath ragged. You should have stayed inside, he murmured, his lips curving into a faint, bitter smile. The hunters approached, their blades raised for the final strike. Maya turned to the hunters, her arms outstretched. Stop. Please, stop. Take me instead. Soren's eyes widened, a flicker of panic breaking through his exhaustion. No, he said weakly, his voice trembling. Don't. The hunters hesitated, their gazes shifting between her and Soren. You would offer yourself to protect him? One of them asked. Yes, Maya said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. I'll do anything. Just don't hurt him. Soren's chest tightened. For the first time in his long existence, he felt something break inside him, a raw, aching pain that he couldn't name. No, he growled, forcing himself to his feet. His wings trembled as he spread them wide, his body blocking Maya from the hunter's view. You won't touch her. The hunters paused, their blades poised. Take me, Soren said, his voice firm. Spare her, and I'll surrender. Maya's heart plummeted. Soren, no. He turned to her, his silver gray eyes soft but resolute. I won't let them hurt you, he said quietly. Not you. The hunters lowered their weapons, their expressions unreadable. Very well, one of them said. Your life for hers. Soren closed his eyes, a faint smile tugging at his lips. At least I'll finally be free. Maya clung to Soren, her fingers digging into his arms as though holding him tight enough might keep him from slipping away. Tears streamed down her cheeks, hot and relentless. You can't do this, she sobbed, shaking her head. You can't leave me. Please don't. Soren cupped her face, his large hands surprisingly gentle against her trembling skin. His silver-gray eyes softened as he studied her, his expression a mix of sorrow and something deeper. Maya, he murmured, his voice low and steady. This is the only way. Her lips quivered as she searched his face for something, anything that might give her hope. But I need you, she whispered. You're all I have. Soren's jaw tightened, and for the briefest moment, his resolve wavered. He'd spent so long looking down on her humanity, mocking her fragility, but now he saw it for what it truly was. Strength. The kind of strength he'd never had, the kind he envied and adored. And you'll go on, he said softly, brushing a tear from her cheek. You'll go on because you're stronger than you think, stronger than I could ever be. The hunters stood silently in the background, their glowing blades lowered but ready. The air buzzed with tension, thick and suffocating. Maya shook her head violently, her hands gripping his shirt. I don't want to be strong, she cried. I want you to stay. Soren's lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile. You're wrong, little human. You don't need me. You never did. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead gently against hers. His voice dropped to a whisper, meant only for her. But I needed you. Soren pulled away, turning to face the hunters. His black wings unfurled one last time, their full, majestic span glowing faintly in the dim light of the forest. Let her live, he said firmly. That's all I ask. The lead hunter stepped forward, their expression unreadable. You understand what this means? They asked. When you surrender, there is no return. Your essence will be unmade. I understand, Soren replied, his voice steady. Maya's heart shattered. No, you can't do this, she screamed, reaching for him, but he stepped out of her grasp. The hunters raised their blades, their movements slow and deliberate. Light began to gather around them, golden and blinding, forming a swirling vortex that pulsed with divine energy. Soren stood tall, his shoulders back, his chin high. He glanced at Maya one last time, his gray eyes filled with something she hadn't seen before. Peace. Maya, he said, his voice strong but soft. Live. For me. And then the light consumed him. The forest erupted in brilliance, a wave of golden energy radiating outward. Maya stumbled back, shielding her face from the blinding glow. She felt the warmth of it, the way it wrapped around her like a final embrace. When the light faded, Soren was gone. Maya collapsed to her knees, the silence of the forest pressing down on her like a weight. Her chest ached, her breaths shallow and ragged. The spot where Soren had stood was empty, save for a faint shimmer in the air, like the ghost of his presence lingering just a moment longer. She pressed her hands to the ground, tears streaming down her face. Why? She whispered, her voice breaking. Why did you have to leave me? The hunters watched her silently for a moment, before turning and vanishing into the shadows, their purpose fulfilled. Maya sat there for what felt like hours, the world around her dim and lifeless. The warmth Soren had brought into her life, the strange, chaotic energy that had turned her quiet existence upside down, was gone. And yet, somewhere deep inside her, she felt whole. A faint glow lingered on her skin, a trace of the light Soren had left behind. It pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat, as though a small part of him still lived within her. Weeks passed, and life moved on. The world didn't stop for Maya's grief, though the ache in her chest remained. She returned to school, walking the same halls where she had once felt invisible. But she wasn't the same. The whispers of her classmates no longer stung. The taunts that had once made her want to disappear now seemed small and meaningless. She stood taller, her steps surer, her gaze steadier. Caleb approached her one afternoon, his smile warm but hesitant. "Hey," he said, his voice gentle. "I haven't seen you around much. Are you okay?" Maya hesitated, then nodded. "I think I will be," she said softly. Caleb tilted his head, studying her. "You seem different, stronger." Maya's lips curved into a faint smile. "I think I finally realized I'm worth more than I thought." That night, Maya sat on her bed, staring out the window at the stars. The forest beyond her house was quiet, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Her fingers traced the faint glow on her skin, the last remnant of Soren's essence. She closed her eyes, remembering the feel of his hands on her face, the sound of his voice, the way he had looked at her like she was something precious. A single tear slipped down her cheek. But this time, it wasn't one of sorrow. She opened her eyes and gazed up at the sky. Among the countless stars, one burned brighter than the rest, a vivid, radiant light that seemed to pulse with life. Maya smiled through her tears, her heart aching but full. "Thank you," she whispered. Though Soren was gone, his presence lingered, in the strength Maya found within herself, in the way she carried his memory, and in the faint glow that reminded her of what they had shared. And as she drifted to sleep, the brightest star in the sky seemed to flicker, as if it too was watching over her. The morning light streamed through Maya's window, painting the walls in soft gold. She stretched, rubbing sleep from her eyes, when a strange feeling stirred in her chest. It was faint at first, like a whisper she couldn't quite hear, but it grew louder, more insistent, as though the air itself was calling to her. She sat up, her heart pounding. Something was different. Slipping on her shoes, she stepped outside into the cool morning air. The sun hadn't fully risen, and the world felt quiet, holding its breath. She walked to the edge of the forest, the same place where Soren had first appeared, and stopped in her tracks. There, standing in the clearing, was him. Maya froze, her breath catching. It couldn't be. He was gone. She had seen him give everything for her. But there he stood, tall and unmistakable, his silver-gray eyes piercing yet warm. This time, his wings were gone, and his form was human, but he was still Soren. Her voice broke before she could say his name. "Soren?" He smiled, a soft, tender curve of his lips, and opened his arms. "Maya." She didn't think. She ran. The distance between them disappeared in a heartbeat, and when she reached him, she threw herself into his arms. Her fingers curled into his shirt as sobs shook her shoulders, tears streaming freely down her face. "You're back? You're really back." Soren held her tightly, his hands cradling her, as though he might never let go. "I am," he murmured into her hair, his voice steady and reassuring. "I am." "But how?" she asked, pulling back just enough to look into his eyes. Her face was wet with tears, her expression raw with hope and disbelief. "I saw you. You gave everything for me. I thought I lost you forever." Soren's hand cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away her tears. "You didn't lose me. You saved me." Her brows furrowed, confusion clouding her gaze. "I don't understand." Soren's voice softened, deep with emotion. "They didn't destroy me, Maya. I was ready to be unmade, to give my existence for yours. But the choice I made, Saving you, giving up everything for a human, changed something in me. It showed them that I wasn't who I used to be, that I wasn't the angel filled with pride and scorn anymore. They saw love. Maya blinked, her breath catching. Love? Yes. Soren smiled, his gray eyes shimmering with warmth. My love for you, Maya. They saw that I was willing to give up eternity to protect you, and that saved me. They didn't destroy me because I've changed, and because of that change, they granted me one request. Maya's heart raced. What did you ask for? His smile deepened, and his hand slipped down to clasp hers. To stay here, to dwell on Earth, as a human, with you. Maya's lips trembled, and her eyes filled with fresh tears. You gave up everything? Heaven? Eternity for me? Soren nodded, his expression steady. For you. For us. And it's the easiest choice I've ever made. A sob burst from her chest, and she threw her arms around him again, holding him so tightly it felt like she might never let go. I can't believe it, she whispered against his shoulder. You're really here. I'm here, he murmured, his voice steady and soothing, and I'm not going anywhere. Maya pulled back, her hands cradling his face as if to convince herself he was real. Her tear-filled eyes searched his, and the depth of emotion she saw there made her chest ache. I love you, she whispered. Soren's gaze softened further, and for the first time, the weight of centuries seemed to lift from his shoulders. And I love you, he replied. More than anything. Their faces were close now, the space between them dissolving as though it had never existed. Soren leaned down, and Maya tilted her head upward, her eyes fluttering closed as their lips met. The kiss was everything, soft and consuming, gentle, yet filled with the fire of all they had endured. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a promise, a bond, the beginning of something new and unbreakable. When they pulled apart, Maya rested her forehead against his, her heart full and steady for the first time in what felt like forever. You're really here, she whispered again, her voice filled with awe. I am, Soren said, his lips brushing against hers. And this time, I'm staying. As the sun broke over the horizon, casting the clearing in golden light, they stood together, their hands intertwined, their hearts beating as one. It wasn't the ending she had imagined, but it was everything she had ever wanted.
Of the scene we'll be making.